This is the same fellow who told you this is going to end by Easter last time. This is the same fellow who told you that, don't worry, we're going to end this by the summer. We're about to go into a dark winter. A dark winter.
Something went wrong this year.
This is a very strange event.
Punjabi co-authored a study detailing a 30% decline of American birds in the last 5 decades due to things like habitat loss. From unprecedented forest fires across the West may also be a fact.
Hyderabad is drowning. The rain has been relentless in the South Indian city, and it's now claimed lives. In one deadly incident, floodwaters pushed a wall onto a house, which collapsed on impact. Other victims were swept away in raging currents.
Give us an idea of the scale of the flooding. We've seen the pictures, and yet Vietnam suffers monsoons every year. How is this different and why?
The scale of devastation is overwhelming. Days of heavy rain, floods, and mudslides in central Vietnam have swept away entire communities. Thousands have lost their homes.
These are considered to be one of the most worst and not affected floods and storm ever in many decades in Vietnam, and affecting life of millions of people.
Catastrophic scenes also in Cambodia. Deadly flash floods have hit the west of the country, prompting the evacuation of some 2,500 people. The military and police have been deployed to assist with the massive operation and hand out much-needed food to isolated communities. And this is the scene in neighboring Vietnam, where flooding has claimed the most casualties in the last week. Up to 1 million people have been impacted by the floods, some 200,000 homes are underwater, and there are fears the death toll could rise.
And the government warns things could get worse as Tropical Storm Sodell approaches. And there's already widespread flooding in the Philippines. Back in Vietnam, rescue teams are preparing for the worst, for what's already being described as the worst floods there in decades.
Critical danger in the west. Overnight, a new wildfire erupting in Colorado as more than 30 infernos burn across the west right now. Parts of Newport Beach are flooded tonight.
But nature found a way to remind us. In the Midwest, punishing 100-mile-an-hour winds. In the Southwest, a brutal succession of floods and droughts. On the coasts,
Delta is bearing down on the Louisiana Gulf Coast.
A freakish number of devastating hurricanes. And in our western states,
The combination of the high heat and dry brush makes for explosive fires.
Historic mega fires that sent a plume of ash and smoke all the way to the East Coast. More than 4 million acres have burned in California alone.
Now to the evacuations tonight. The wildfire emergency in the west. Red flag warnings across 6 states tonight. One fire in Colorado exploding in size overnight.
The 2 largest wildfires in that state's history, burning just 10 miles apart, and weather conditions this weekend are threatening to make things worse.
Like these firefighters flanked by flames as they drive to safety.
You are a hero, my hero.
Tonight, the second largest wildfire in Colorado history could become the most massive the state has ever seen. It's already burned an area larger than the city of Chicago, and it might merge with an even bigger fire just a few miles away.
Locked in a desperate scramble to save lives while struggling to protect their own.
Get moving now. The fire's coming over you.
The so-called East Troublesome Fire exploding, at times erupting at a rate of 6,000 acres an hour. That's nearly 80 football fields per minute.
High winds and dry conditions creating a perfect storm.
You can see behind me here, the fire is in the trees. The firefighters call this crowning. And when that happens in these conditions, the fire is virtually unstoppable.
I've never seen anything like what we experienced 2 nights ago.
Oh my God.
Forcing the evacuations of thousands, fast becoming the second largest fire in Colorado history, now at nearly 190,000 acres, proving deadly.
Under a dark orange midday sky, they started evacuating the town of Estes Park. Less than 12 miles away, the Cameron Peak fire also burning. It's the largest in state history.
Go! Go!
The
fire also forcing families to make dramatic escapes. 7 fires now scorching the state, burning more than 375,000 acres.
A wildfire crisis unlike anything residents in the Rocky Mountain state have ever seen.
Never in the American West has so much burned so quickly. Bone-dry humidity and powerful winds. From Washington State to Southern California, entire communities were wiped out.
In the last 20 years, we've experienced twice the number of weather disasters as we did in the previous 20 years.
Smoke from the dozens of major wildfires mushroomed into thick blankets of clouds so vast they could be seen. It's hard to fathom that the worst may be yet to come.
A city in chaos. Across Lagos, buildings have been torched and sporadic clashes have erupted. This is what sparked the outcry. Soldiers shooting unarmed protesters in the country's largest city.
They are shooting our cars. They are shooting.
Nigeria's been in dictatorship for almost half of its life as an independent nation. Many of its citizens worried Tuesday's events echo the dark days of military rule, and they're determined to make sure that doesn't happen.
Chile is a country used to earthquakes, but few people expected the shake-up that we've seen this past year. In just 12 months, Chile went from being an oasis of stability, as its president described it, to a country wanting to rewrite the rules. It all started when Santiago hiked its metro ticket prices by just 4 cents. It represented the tipping point, unleashing anger and resentment among millions struggling to make ends meet in a country that on the surface looked like it was succeeding. The demonstrations were largely peaceful, but clashes with protesters and heavy-handed responses by the authorities have marked this past year too. After a pause in protesting because of COVID-19, people have returned to the streets. Peaceful protests like this, and more troubling ones like this. Tension is high in Chile, and so are expectations.
In Beirut, demonstrations have taken place to commemorate the first anniversary of a mass protest movement demanding political reform in Lebanon.
1 year since the protests began in Lebanon. 1 year of rising and fading hopes. People came from different backgrounds and sects, commemorating a pivotal moment in Lebanon's modern history. A moment when the Lebanese people pushed for change, but were faced with devastating economic, health, and security challenges. As they continue their march, they raise their voice with anger. Anger of a corrupt and impotent government who not only made the country poorer, but failed to protect.
As lines for COVID testing stretch blocks in some states, the results are rocking regions big and small.
We are, no doubt whatsoever, in a second surge. This is what it looks like.
Chicago now under a business curfew as Illinois just cracked 6,000 daily cases for the first time Saturday. And farther west in the heartland,
wear a dang mask when you're indoors. We're not asking you to sign up for the draft here.
The Dakotas ranking first and second for COVID cases per capita in the country as South Dakota's Governor Kristi Noem faces record infections and hospitalizations in her state. Noem writing in an op-ed this week, if folks want to wear a mask, they should be free to do so. Similarly, those who don't want to wear a mask shouldn't be shamed into wearing one, and government should not mandate it. Dr. Anthony Fauci says it's time to demand more.
Well, if people are not wearing masks, then maybe we should be mandating it.
The U.S. steamrolling through all-time highs, on Saturday notching 79,059 cases, nearly matching Friday's record, but with several states not reporting over the weekend. As states once showing progress are now flashing warning signs. Massachusetts exceeded 1,000 daily cases for the first time since May, with New York and New Jersey hovering near 2,000. Even so, some are skeptical.
There's so much hype going around right now.
But for those who have dealt with loss,
It's been devastating.
like Catherine Hernandez of Arizona.
where he is losing the public's trust.
That's all I hear about now. That's all I hear. Turn on television. Right? COVID, 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 COVID. A plane goes down. 500 people dead. They don't talk about it. By the way, on November 4th, you won't hear about it anymore.
Friday marked the highest daily number of cases since the pandemic began, with hospitals in the West and Midwest overwhelmed and death counts rising.
In my 34 years as a physician, I have never seen so much suffering from a single disease over such a short period of time.
We are reporting 3,874 new cases for a total of 33 confirmed cases since the start of this pandemic.
It made her say that. Look like she started laughing and everything.
Live with it. As I told her, we're not learning to live it, we're learning to die with it. Because he's doing nothing.
As the pandemic surges, President Trump appears focused on personal grievances.
Spain has declared a new state of emergency in an effort to curb soaring coronavirus infections. Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez announced on Sunday that the measures to come into force that evening will require all regions except the Canary Islands to impose a nighttime curfew and limit the number of people allowed to meet to 6.
Es extrema. Es de hecho,
travel between regions will also be banned in certain cases.
España, desde la aprobación de nuestra Constitución.
Spain imposed one of the toughest lockdowns early on in the pandemic and then relaxed curbs over the summer. But like many other European countries, it's seen a second wave hit in recent weeks and now has one of the highest numbers of infections in Western Europe. Total cases.
Turning now to your headlines. 5 top aides for Vice President Pence test positive for COVID-19. Among them, Chief of Staff Mark Short and Political Advisor Marty Ost. Both are in quarantine. The New York Times reporting 3 other VP staffers have tested positive. Vice President Pence and the Second Lady tested negative for the virus yesterday.
Roman Catholic cardinals on Sunday, and the move included a first. Archbishop Wilton Gregory of Washington, D.C. will become the first African American to hold the rank. 9 of the new cardinals are eligible to enter a conclave to elect Francis's successor after his death or resignation. All 13 will be elevated to the high rank at a ceremony at the Vatican on November the 28th. The selection of more cardinal electors increases the possibility that the next pope will be someone who will continue his policies. Francis has now appointed about 57% of cardinals.
Being recorded right across Europe. In France, there are now 1 million cases. 2/3 of its population are under curfew. The country's highly regarded health service is becoming overwhelmed. And there's the starkest warning yet about the resurgence of the virus.
If we look at the trajectory of the epidemic, the virus is spreading more quickly now than in the spring.
In Spain, the government says the pandemic is out of control, and Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez has released research from a public health institute tripling the number of COVID cases from 1 to 3 million. He says some regions failed to detect the actual number of cases. He's being criticised by some regions for not imposing a national lockdown, but he refuses to do so.
We want a virus. Michigan reporting a new daily record of COVID-19 cases. State officials call today's numbers alarming and say now is the time we must really take this seriously. Michigan reporting 3,338 new cases with 35 more deaths. 27 of those reported are from a review of records. In addition to today's case count setting a record, we also saw a record number of cases for this past week. Michigan's rolling 7-day average, 1,876 cases. Larry Spruill is live.
Europe, they're trying to save a life. The intensive care unit here in the Czech town of Kyjov near Brno is nearly full with COVID-19 patients. 75 staff at this hospital are off with the virus. For their colleagues, these are worrying times.
The staff are doing everything, even at the expense of their personal needs and time. Even on their days off, they are working to prevent an Italian scenario.
Daily infections in the Czech Republic have hit a record high of more than 15,000. That's despite tight restrictions, including limits on people's movement and a ban on gatherings of more than 2 people. In Poland, daily infections reached a record of nearly 14,000 on Friday as President Andrzej Duda visited the National Stadium, which is being transformed into a field hospital. Duda, who's 48, is now in quarantine after testing positive for COVID-19. He says he feels fine, insisting he and his team followed the safety measures.
I apologise to everybody who had to go into quarantine because they met with me in recent days. Please believe me, if I had had any symptoms of coronavirus, all meetings would have been cancelled.
On Saturday, police in Warsaw used tear gas against protesters angry about new restrictions. The country's entered a so-called red zone lockdown, with the partial closure of primary schools and restaurants, and people above the age of 70 are being asked to stay at home. Over the border in Germany, the coronavirus death toll is now more than 10,000. The number of COVID-19 patients in intensive care has jumped by 2/3 in a week. Chancellor Merkel has warned that people's actions now will determine what the winter period will be like.
Wir sind nicht machtlos gegen das Virus.
We're not helpless in facing the virus. Our actions determine the strength and speed at which it spreads. And what's imperative for all of us is to reduce contact, to meet fewer people.
Can I make the prediction? 1,000 years ago, there was a great conjunction. I was there. 3 suns lined up. That's when the crystal cracked. That's when the Nexus appeared. And the mystics. Another great conjunction coming up. Anything could happen. The whole world might burn up. Now, ask what the Great Conjunction is. What's the Great Conjunction?
What's the Great Conjunction? You tell me.
The Great Conjunction is the